There's a new front in Syria. Turkish troops crossing into Afrin province under the control of Syrian Kurdish forces since 2012. The push that had started 4 days ago, part of plans to prevent the Kurds from establishing a continuous territory along the Turkish border. It comes days after the United States pledged a 2-year commitment to support Syria's Kurds. Will Ankara make good on its design to next go for Manbij? That's an Arab-majority town that's also under Kurdish control and inside of that U.S. protected zone. It would be a direct challenge to a fellow NATO member. The U.S. Secretary of State happens to be here in Paris for a conference on chemical weapons in Syria, which serves as a reminder that the Assad regime, along with its Russian and Iranian backers, remains an integral part of this story. And while we focus on the Turkish border, Damascus's offensive on nearby Idlib province continues, complete with a food blockade for civilians. As always with Syria, the argument rages over where the priorities lie. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Erdogan's new front. And with us from Ankara, Ahmet Berat ÇONKAR, member of parliament for the ruling AK party and head of the Turkish delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir.
Also in the Turkish capital, correspondent Jasper Mortimer is with us. Good to see you. Here in the studio, France 24 senior correspondent James Andre, who covered the liberation of Raqqa in Syria. And from Washington, Michael Predge, an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, former intelligence advisor to General Petraeus and to Kurdish Peshmerga forces. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Ankara is calling it Operation Olive Branch. James Andre, before we turn to the rest of our panel, let's look at the map, because that's what's key in this.
Absolutely, it's a good idea. Now, I'm going to go to the map right here. Now, we have a map that is going to come up and on this screen in just a second. Here it is. Perfect. So here we have Syria. Indeed, as you see, this green part is what is controlled by the Syrian government. This orange part is all the part that is controlled by the Kurdish, basically PYD, YPG forces. Now, indeed, they have grown a large chunk of territory here along the Turkish border. Turkey is right here. And where most of the fighting is concentrating right now is here in Afrin. Now, this is the first part in which the Kurds actually set up what we have now, which is a kind of a proto-state, if you will, especially in all this part. I've been there, indeed, earlier on last year in November. I was there again, and indeed what we have here is indeed a zone which is completely controlled, administrated by the PYD party and secured by Syrian Democratic Forces, which are a force which combines both Kurdish fighters and Arab fighters. They are indeed under the control of the YPG. Now, indeed, what's been happening here is that for the Turkish, the Turks consider that the YPG is part of PKK, or is an emanation of the
insurgents, the Kurdish insurgency that they're fighting since 2015.
Exactly. Indeed. Well, no, they've been at war with PKK.
War, sorry,
absolutely,
right, yes.
But it started back in 1984.
Sure.
And indeed, Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the PKK, is in prison in Turkey. And indeed, the Western forces consider that the YPG is something different from PKK, but indeed for the Turks, it is the same organization. Now, roughly a week ago, what the Americans did was say they wanted to form a border force to secure the border along Syria with Turkey of about 30,000 men, and they said that half the armored personnel deployed there would be YPG fighters. And this, of course, to Turkey is totally unacceptable. They say that amounts to creating a terrorist army along the border with Turkey, and this is why they've launched Operation Olive Branch. Now, this is very much the problem. Now, as you can see, there is this enclave of Afrin, and for the moment, the Turks are concentrating their effort here.
And just to be clear, Afrin is not part of that U.S. protected zone.
Well, this is what the US is saying now. What they were saying before is that basically, if we can have that previous map eventually again, but the YPG and Syrian Democratic Forces helped the US and the coalition fight the Islamic State group in this part, if you like, which is here. And indeed, they're the forces that liberated Raqqa with the help of the US Army. Now, they were indeed very much allies, and the US has got bases close to Manbij. They've got personnel in this part. Indeed, they have military presence in this northern part of Syria, which is under YPG control. But indeed, they say, the Americans say, that they have no military presence in Afrin, and that all they can do is indeed work on the diplomatic front.
Ahmet Berat ÇONKAR, listening to James Andre's explanation there as we looked at the map. Explain to us the timeline. Why this offensive at this particular moment? Is it triggered by that announcement out of Washington last week?
Of course, that announcement by Washington also rang the alarm bells in Turkey. But of course, our operation is not just because of that announcement. Turkey has been receiving terrorist threats and attacks from the Afrin region for a very long time. There has been a lot of infiltration by the PKK, PYD from this region inside Turkey, and we have seen suicide car bombings. After 2015, we had 14 terrorist incidents inside Turkey, and most of the training was done in the Syrian part that is controlled by the PKK's Syrian wing, PYD, YPG. So this area has been on our focus because it is extremely threatening for Turkey, and also the southern border of NATO is threatened by a terrorist organization which is coming inside of Turkey and organizing terrorist attacks. And also they are trying to get access to the Mediterranean, and by sea routes they would like to access Europe. So this kind of important location for the terrorist organization is a very dangerous threat for Turkey.
But why now? Why at this particular moment the offensive?
Because, as you see, the United States has promised that the relationship with SDF, so-called SDF, which is the other name of YPG, would be a tactical relationship until defeating Daesh, and basically they would end supplying armaments and training to this group after the Daesh threat is eliminated. However, we have seen with the announcement from the U.S. Defense Department that they are planning to trying to legitimize this terrorist organization by naming them as a border security force or internal policing force, which could not be accepted for a serious territorial integrity as a sovereign country. This basically ring the alarm bells for Turkey. So we have seen that the United States is not keeping its promises that they have done before.
All right, so Michael Pregent, explain to us the timing of that announcement last week out of Washington to stay on for 2 years to back those Kurdish-led forces in Syria.
Yes, so the decision last week to do that, I do believe that was concerning to Erdogan. We continue to say that it's not the YPG, it's the Syrian Defense Forces, but the YPG is the command and control of those units. They decide who is allowed in the SDF. They've conscripted Sunni Arabs in Raqqa to join the YPG. So when we say Syrian Defense Forces, everybody else hears YPG. And it doesn't matter what the balance is. If the YPG is part of it, it's concerning to Turkey.
Concerning to Turkey, and your reaction to Ahmet Berat ÇONKAR saying that, well, this offensive that's taken place in Afrin province, it does have to do with that announcement from Washington. Michael Pregent?
Oh, yeah, it does. I think Erdogan's testing to see what he can get away with. It's very difficult for a U.S. embedded advisor with the YPG or the Syrian Defense Forces to say, the YPG in Afrin, they're different than you guys, because the YPG in Afrin aligned itself with Russia, with Assad and Iran, and actually invited Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors into Afrin. So we can't divide the YPG when you're dealing in a situation where we're stepping away from criticizing Erdogan for attacking Kurds in Afrin, and we're trying to isolate or insulate our YPG forces in Manbij and in Raqqa and say, well, we'll protect you. It doesn't make any sense to them. If you allow part of their group to be attacked in Afrin, what guarantees do they have that we're not going to allow it in Manbij and Raqqa? And we're hearing that from the Free Syrian Army. There was a delegation that came to D.C. that I met with last week with some colleagues, and they basically hinted that this is the next step for Raqqa as well. Turkish forces backed by FSA will go to remove the YPG. Their argument is that the YPG is not allowing Sunni refugees from Turkey to come back into Raqqa. And our argument is, well, they're still doing mine clearing operations there. But again, this is a mistake of not building the right clear and hold force to retake Sunni areas. You don't retake Sunni areas with Kurds. You take it with Sunni Arabs. They were great in Kobani, a Kurdish town. Using the YPG to take back Sunni areas from ISIS will likely result in security backslide.
But the criticism, Michael, that's been made is that the Arab forces just weren't effective, and the most effective Sunni fighters sided with the more hardline groups.
Well, there was no attempt to build an actual Sunni force. Early on, when General Nagata tried to build that force, there were so many constraints put on him by our National Security Council. You couldn't have anybody join the force that was ever involved with a group that could be linked to a terrorist group. We didn't do that in Iraq during the surge. We actually took former al-Qaeda members, former Sunni insurgent members, and they were part of the awakening, the Sunni awakening, that basically decimated al-Qaeda. No attempt was made to reconcile Sunni Arabs that had joined Jabhat al-Nusra or joined other groups to form this Sunni force, a local Sunni force, from Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa to expel ISIS and to hold territory. It's been done with Kurdish forces primarily. And
let me bring in James Andre on this. James, no attempt. You heard Michael say no attempt was made.
Well, maybe no direct attempts, but in the very first place, the Western powers kind of indirectly through Turkey backed the Free Syrian Army, and then eventually the opposition in Syria fragmented, and it became much more difficult. This is why after the Manbij battle, indeed, the United States turned to the YPG forces, who, and this is important to stress, the United States or the European Union do not consider as a terrorist force. It's only Turkey that makes the link between the PKK and the YPG, though there are very obviously links, since, just as a detail, but when you're in the armoured vehicles over there, you do see pictures of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the PKK. You can actually see those, photos inside, etc., etc. There are very clear links, but the US and the Westerners do not consider they're the same organisation.
Jasper Mortimer, in Ankara.
May I jump in here Jasper, for a second, please?
Just briefly, let me, very briefly, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to just say that it's very clear that the YPG PKK link is out there, because when I remember the Senate hearing in April 2016, Senator Lindsey Graham was questioning the Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter in the Senate hearing, and the conversation goes by like this. He says that our Turkish allies are very angry. I have been in Ankara because of our support to YPG, and they are saying that this is just the Syrian wing of the PKK terrorist organization. So the Ashton Carter says, we are aware of that. The PKK is the terrorist organization. We and our allies accept PKK as the terrorist organization. And we know that there is substantial links and ties of YPG, PYD to the PKK. And at the end of the conversation, Senator Lindsey Graham says, for the United States, it is the dumbest thing to do that we are doing to our Turkish allies. This whole concept is absurd, he says. In the Senate hearing, you can look at the recordings.
All right, let me bring in Jasper Mortimer on this.
Documents,
let me bring in Jasper Mortimer on this.
YPG connection is clearly outlined in all NATO documents.
Jasper Mortimer, what's the mood right now? 4 days in, we've just gotten word of a second Turkish casualty after the launch of this offensive. What's the mood when it comes to the timing and the reasons?
Are you talking about the timing of the attack?
Of the operation by the Turkish government?
Yes, I think the other panelists have elaborated on that well. I think it was very clear that Turkey saw that America was raising its support for the Syrian Kurds. You know, Tillerson said it wasn't a border force, but the coalition announced it as a border force. Whatever you want to call it, the Americans were going to up their assistance to the Syrian Kurds. And I think Turkey gambled that it was better to get in quickly before that greater American assistance had come into play. Turkey doesn't actually want a fight with Americans. There are some 2,000 US personnel on the ground in Syria, and they would have been used in training that border force or whatever it was going to be called. And so Turkey sort of struck in a preemptive mood.
Struck in a preemptive mood. We're going to pick up on that. We have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.